Good evening. My name is Larry Levy. I am the Executive Dean of the National Center for Suburban Studies. You'll hear a little bit more from me, but only a little bit more later. Right now, I'd like to introduce Hofstra Provost, Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, Charlie Reardon.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for visiting our campus and being a part of this very important discussion, and really a celebration in some respects of fine work that was very consequential work that was done a decade ago. So we're really pleased to have a distinguished panel with us tonight. You'll hear about the podcast. All of this is a great collaboration between and among a variety of the schools here at Hofstra University. We are glad you are here to partake in all that we have to offer. We hope that those of you that are visiting us will come back again often and take advantage of all of the community outreach and the great programming that we'll offer here at Hofstra University for you. And with this, I guess I'm turning it to Chris or back to Larry?
Back to me.
Back to Larry, but let's keep him limited. He only really has another 2 paragraphs. We're going to let him.
And then from me, Dean Julian Koo of the law school.
Oh, less than 2 paragraphs.
All right, I just want to welcome everyone here to the law school. It's just a quick word about the unusual unusual role that clinical legal education takes. Remember, this case started, of course, as a case. We see the happy outcome here, but actually, this is also an educational institution, and I don't know how many students, but many students over many years, in addition to working really hard and achieving a really good outcome, the other thing that happened was students learned how to become lawyers by working on this case, right? It was a dual role of clinical education to both teach lawyers how to be a lawyer while also trying to do good things in our community. This is a type of education that the law school has long believed in and has for many decades vested in, and this is a terrific example of that kind of education working in the world outside the law school. I'll just say one thing as a lawyer, we teach our students, you can work hard, you can be the best lawyer in the world, and you might still not win your case, right? Happily for us here, we had great lawyering, hard work by students over many years, plus led by Professor Steph Krieger, and we had also a happy outcome in this case. But it's the larger lessons about lawyering and being a lawyer is also a huge part of what happened here. So I want to really pay tribute and celebrate the outcome here, but also remind this is an educational project as well, and we all learned a tremendous amount from this project as well. So welcome to law school, and thank you for being here.
Again, I said Larry Levy, I'm Executive Dean of the National Center for Suburban Studies. It's an academic research center that focuses on, to put it short, suburbia's problems and promise. And about 10 years ago, and this project, by the way, has a backstory that I'll try to tell very quickly. About 10 years ago, we received a fairly substantial grant from a family foundation, the Turan Family Foundation, and they wanted us to collect oral histories of primarily elderly African Americans and Latinos who were here at the dawn of the suburban era, back in the days of Levittown, when you had racial covenants that said, if you're not white, you can't live there. And we ended up collecting 75 oral histories. We collected artifacts, the uniform of the first non-white police officer in Freeport Village. And the Schomburg Center in Harlem, the premier research center for African culture, African-American culture in history, heard about this. And we ended up partnering on an exhibit at the Schomburg Center called Black Suburbia from Levittown to Ferguson. And this ran for 3 months there, and they told us it was one of the most intensely viewed exhibits they've ever had. Then came phase 2. And we realized that just collecting oral histories in addition to being a little boring, frankly, I mean, it's challenging, but you ask questions, you let it run. We wanted to do something different. And that's when Chris connected with Steph, and we ended up on a 7-year journey with twists and turns that I won't get into. But today, not only did the case end well due to this hero and his students, but so did the podcast. So I'm going to step aside now and turn it over to Mario Murillo, who was one of the key artists who brought this to fruition. Mario and his students as well.
Thank you, Larry. I feel like I have to take an oath. I swear. That's the truth. No, it's great. I'm used to a different space, so if it's a little kind of sloppy, please forgive me for that at the outset. But it is great to be here. There's so many people to thank. It's unbelievable, and I don't want to forget anybody. But I must say I am overjoyed with the fact that this is done finally. It's a long story, and it has been 6.5 years since Chris Neat asked me to join this project, given my background in radio journalism, as well as my background covering a lot of similar stories that were happening on Long Island at the turn of the century and the early part of the 2000s. So when I was invited to be part of this project, I was very enthusiastic. I didn't realize it was going to take 6.5, almost 7 years to do, but I'm very happy to see it completed, and I think it came out pretty well. And in hindsight, I guess it was deliberate, because now it's the 10th anniversary of the settlement of the case, so we kind of planned that all along. We figured that would come out in 2024. I'm overjoyed. I want to thank, obviously, the center, the National Center for Suburban Studies, Ina Katz, who was like our person who was really helping us orchestrate a lot of the administration of this project. Of course, Larry Levy, of course, Chris Neat, who's on the panel and was a key part of this. The law school of Steph Krieger, of course, and all his students, not only the hundreds of students who worked on the case during the process, but seemingly another 100 students that worked on the podcast with us over the last 6.5 years. And including Emma Kerner, who's with us tonight, so thank you, Emma, as well. I thank all my colleagues in the Herbert School of Communication, of course, Deane Lukashevitz, who's here. Thank you, Mark. I'm glad to see you. And his commitment and the school's commitment to community-based journalism and reporting on the ground in the community. We're also working on a project around news deserts. Even though this story got a lot of coverage during the time it was unfolding, years ago, 15 years ago, et cetera, these kinds of stories and the voices of the people that we highlight in this story are generally not covered in our local news. And so that's one of the things that we're working on at the Herbert School, is emphasizing the importance of community journalism. Scott Brinton and Ashish Kumar, two colleagues who have been working on this project. Keep your eyes out, because it's an ongoing project, and we're hoping to get more, to draw attention to the fact that our community is not being covered properly. So many students at the Herbert School that worked on this project. I want to thank Cody Millar, who's a graduate student in journalism, who helped us put together the website for the project itself. Many students who worked on the site visits with the residents and as we're beginning production, with interviews with the many different people who were involved, with transcribing those interviews, with translating those interviews, with recording voiceovers about those interviews, because many of the voices obviously were recorded in Spanish. Many students that were involved. I want to really give a big shout out to a young man there, Hunter Spears, who graduated in 2022. Hunter Spears is the sound designer and really the media creator, the production person who made us cross the finish line. Because if it wasn't for Hunter, and I say this without hyperbole, if it wasn't for Hunter, we'd still be waiting another few more years to get this.
20th anniversary.
So thank you, Hunter, for that, sound designer. And he, 2022 alum, graduate from the Herbert School. And there's probably a lot more. Folks from marketing and communication, Berman and Ginny Greenberg who helped us with this, Jackson Snellings, and the folks here at IT here in the building. So thank you for all of that. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then what we're going to do is we're going to play. We selected a few clips from the podcast, really 5 clips to represent the 5 episodes. It is in 5 episodes. and we're going to try to kind of talk about and navigate a little bit with the panelists that we have here. So let me just introduce everybody, and then we'll get started. And again, it's going to be a little awkward. We'll see how it works. Hopefully it works fine. So first we have Steph Krieger, attorney, professor Steph Krieger, who's a legend, right? And in so many ways, not only here at Hofstra and on Long Island, but nationally for the work that he's done for many years, fighting for justice, especially fighting for justice for those who are least served by the justice system too often. He's the Richard J. Cardali Distinguished Professor in Trial Advocacy and the Director of the Center for Applied Legal Reasoning. And he's, of course, here at the Maurice Deane School of Law at Hofstra University, and he's really the brainchild behind this. And so this podcast is in many ways a tribute to his initiatives during this story, but also his work that he's been doing for years. My friend and colleague, Dr. Christopher Neat, who is the Academic Director of the National Center for Suburban Studies. He's a professor of applied social research in the Department of Sociology here at Hofstra University, the chair of, and you chair of sociology still? How much longer? Yeah, longtime colleague and collaborator at the Center for Civic Engagement, which we both happen to serve as advisory board members of the CCE. If you don't know about it, engaging the community on many levels here at Hofstra University and surrounding areas. So that's great. And also a voice that you hear on this podcast a lot. Meredith Ryan, who is a graduate of the Hofstra Law School from 2012, if I'm not mistaken. A former law student who worked on this case, so it's great to have her here. And she's now at the Law Office of Meredith L. Ryan. So welcome to the session. And then I don't think Ana Maria Mora Gomez is here. Is Ana Maria? Okay, so we're waiting for a couple of representatives, members of the Secatogue 9, the people who are on the way. Yeah, so she's on her way. So Ana Maria is on her way, one of the people that we interview, one of the voices, one of the stories we hear from. But we are joined by Isidoro Rivera, who's joining us here, and he's, again, you're going to hear some of his story, but Isidoro, bienvenido, un gusto verte otra vez después de tantos años y felicitaciones. I want to thank you for joining us. So let's get started. I'm going to stay standing because we're trying to cue with Emma some of the audio. As you probably would imagine, and if you haven't checked it out, the podcast is being published every day this week on the Long Island Advocate, which is the Lawrence Herbert School of Communications hyperlocal news site that we've set up a few years ago. So you can check it out there. You can also check it out and see all 5 episodes on Spotify and some of the other commercial, wherever you get your podcasts, as they say on the radio. And it's also airing on a number of stations. In fact, tomorrow in the morning, if you're up at 7 a.m., tune into WRHU Radio, Hofstra University, 88.7. Episode 3 will be airing tomorrow morning, so you can listen to it. It's going to begin airing on Friday at 5 p.m. at WBAI Pacifica Radio, 99.5 FM here in New York, every Friday from 5 to 6 p.m. Nice little prime time drive slot. And then it's airing on WLIW, and I'm not sure where. And so our friends at WLIW FM, and they're in Suffolk County, they're also going to begin airing it sometime, I think in 2 weeks, a week from next week. So we have a lot of partners who are recognizing the importance of the story and are going to be playing it. So again, 5 episodes, many elements. It took a long time because we really mapped out, and we had to map out the many different nuances of the story. But the first episode, what we really recognized is that we really needed to hear the voices of the residents that were impacted by this, right? Too often in this, when we hear in the news stories about immigration reform, about migrant crisis at the border, whenever we hear about immigration, we either hear the political pundits, very often with hateful language, or we hear experts talking stuff. But we rarely, if ever, hear the voices of the people most impacted by these policies that are not resolved for decades in this country and still leading to more and more hardship, pain, and suffering. And so we felt that it was very important in order to understand what happened with the Secatogue 9, in order to understand this case and how it's a reflection of housing discrimination, racial discrimination, attacks against migrants, we needed to hear their voices. And not just their voices about what happened in this case, but why they came to the United States, how they got here. And that was part of it. And there are so many different stories, right? And the Secatogue 9, the residents of the complex that we were reporting about, they were unique, from threats of gang violence by some and forced to leave because of gang violence, to domestic abuse, a couple of different variations of that, to the political unrest and insecurities that were happening as a result of the US-led war in Central America in the 1980s, which many of us remember very closely. So there was a lot of reasons why these folks came, and so we thought we would share that trauma. And most of it was led by trauma, making them leave their families and come to the United States, and eventually coming to Long Island and Farmingdale. Right. So the first clip we're going to hear is Antonio Bustillo, who came from Honduras, right? And it was interesting because he was one of the few people who really talked about how the political conflicts that were happening in Central America at the time impacted him. But it wasn't like they were under the threat of violence. It was more the threat of losing your entire community by force dislocation, right? So he was in Honduras. He was seeing his family members and friends leave slowly and migrating to the United States. To a certain point, he got to the point where he needed to go again. So I mean, we can hear this first clip. Again, they're all about 2 minutes. We're going to try to run through them as quickly as we can. So here's the first clip. No volume.
These were some of the most violent conflicts. How the war manifested itself throughout the region depended on the local government's connection to the United States. As a close neighbor to the countries with some of the most violent conflicts, Honduras was in the center of U.S. strategic thinking. Juan Antonio Bustillo was still in his youth at the time, living in the northern part of Honduras when the wars in Central America were raging.
Sí, recuerdo, yo era...
Yes, I remember. I was still a very young boy. I was a teenager when that war happened, and it had a lot of impact because of the border in El Salvador. There was a conflict in El Salvador, the Civil War. There was also the war in Nicaragua, the so-called Contra War against the Nicaraguan government.
La Contra-Revolución.
Ironically, in Bustillo's community in Honduras, the people were welcoming refugees who were escaping the violence from neighboring Nicaragua and El Salvador on a regular basis.
Y a nosotros nos afectó mucho porque muchas personas se venían.
Because of the war, a lot of people came to our area looking for work and better opportunities. It affected me a lot because I would see entire families with children who came looking for work. So as much as we could, we tried to support them. If we had work, we would offer it to them whenever we could, because they were people who needed to work.
Porque eran gente que necesitaban trabajar.
Although very young at the time, Bustillo remembers how everyday life in his northern Honduras hometown was impacted during the war.
Siempre me recuerdo que nosotros en esa época...
I remember at that time, you would hear more radio stations broadcasting from Nicaragua than from Honduras. Because there were no repeaters to carry the national Honduras stations, you could only hear Honduras stations by chance. We listened to more stations from Belize or Nicaragua, and many Sandinista stations. Sometimes, soldiers would pass and threaten us to turn off that radio. We listened not so much for what they spoke about, but rather that they played music. And at that time, there was no television. There was only the radio.
So he continues, and the story goes and starts focusing on all the different residents that we interviewed. There was 7 of the families in the Secatogue 9 were featured in the series, and we hear their story. But the issue of, and so Bustillo doesn't really talk too much about the trauma, but that was one of the things that was focused on in the series. And so I want to throw it first to you, Steph, because that was not only part of their story, but it was also part of the approach you guys took, that the team took as a legal strategy to focus on the trauma.
I first want to have a call out to those members of the Secatogue 9 who are here this evening, because they are the real heroes of this podcast and of this case. First, Isidoro Rivera and his wife, Luz Rivera. Mr. Alvarez and his wife, Maria Alinda Alvarez. And Brian Fredericks. And then one other person that I want to mention before I begin, and that's Carrie Galvin. Carrie Galvin was a student in the clinic in 2004. And late in the afternoon, I came back from a meeting with the Workplace Project, and they said there's these 54 families that have been evacuated from a home, and they are experiencing the trauma of being evacuated from a home. And can you interview them tonight? And that night, late into the night, and I can still see the reception area at the clinic, there were family after families that came in. And because of Carrie's commitment that evening, she laid the groundwork for bringing us here today. The Secatogue 9 experienced trauma not just in leaving their native country. When they got here, they experienced the trauma of living in a village where there were blog postings that were filled with hateful messages, whereas Carrie was talking about earlier this evening, where they had to live in a building with sagging ceilings, with roaches, with mice, with mold. And they had to then live with the prospect of being evicted from their buildings because of a redevelopment plan that the village had hatched. And then they had to endure 8 years of litigation with all the ups and downs of what federal court practice is about, which those of you that are lawyers and those of you that are law students here are going to encounter really so much. So they had to deal with that trauma throughout. And what we found is, as we began to prepare for trial, Meredith is going to tell you about some of that planning for the trial, that one of the themes that we were able to develop was the trauma. But this isn't just about a redevelopment and some people that just had to leave their buildings. These were people that had developed a community. The Secatogue 9 were a community. Those folks that came in to Carrie Galvin that night had a community there. And that community was being destroyed. And that became the theme that we put together. Just one other thing. One of the challenges that we faced in preparing for trial was that I think many of our clients didn't want to remember what had happened before. They didn't want to have to tell their story again. And I think that this is, the students at the clinic were able, through very compassionate, very client-centered interviewing and counseling, were able to get them to tell their story. So that if we would have gone to trial, that 6-week trial would be planned to start on January 14th, 2014. If we would have gone to trial, all of the Secatogue 9 would have been able to tell their stories despite the trauma that they had experienced over the years.
Okay, we're joined now by Ana Maria Gomez, and yeah, we had a little mishap there, so now we're going to continue here. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, Chris, if you can take that. Bueno, okay, we're all set, and let's, please, everybody use the microphone so that way back in the room, in the back, they can hear you. All right, so that's that. I want to move on quickly and kind of get everybody in the conversation. But despite the, and so we'll get to the second clip now, because despite the fact that this trauma happened, the trauma was also coming to the United States, but for some reason, all 9 of these families decided to land in Farmingdale. And there was something nice about Farmingdale. They all were attracted by it. So this clip here really shows how, in many ways, they saw it as a place to build a community, a place to kind of grow their families and reemerge after the trauma that they faced at home and trying to settle here in the United States. But unfortunately, we saw, obviously, that didn't last long enough. So we'll hear the next clip and then we'll maybe kind of go on.
The Secatogue Nine made it here precisely because of their courage and their resilience. And once here, they somehow all found their way to Farmingdale, where they began forming a community and rebuilding their lives.
Bueno, al principio uno se siente como un pollo comprado, ¿verdad? Que no quiere uno.
At first, you feel like a bought chicken. You don't want to be here. You just want to leave.
Pero
Elsa Mejia Villalobos came to Farmingdale after migrating from El Salvador when she was 29 years old.
ya estando acá, yo trabajé duro, hija de a mi hijo, y me gustó mucho ese pueblo ahí porque
I worked hard and brought my son here. I lived in 5 places, always in Farmingdale. I really liked it here because everything was so close. The bus stop, the train station, the deli, the laundry. I would grab a shopping cart from Walmart, assemble the bags and go wash.
me gustó mucho porque todo tenía cerca la paradera.
Everything was so nearby and convenient. So I lived here for a long time.
Todo tenía cerca el deli, entonces ahí viví mucho tiempo.
Like Elsa Mejia, all of the families of the Secatogue Nine were attracted to the village of Farmingdale for a variety of reasons. Relative calm, good schools, convenience, access to shopping close by. Ana Maria Mora Gomez describes herself as an independent woman. She says it didn't take her long to realize that Farmingdale was going to be her new home after all she had gone through in Mexico. If you recall, she was forced to leave her children behind to escape the relentless domestic abuse of her husband.
Cuando me di cuenta, desde el momento en que yo vine en el 2000, desde que yo entré a por esa country, o Hempstead Park, y miré.
From the moment I arrived in 2000, I liked it here. I came in on that one road by Conklin Avenue, and I saw the gym, the library, a restaurant, a bank, and I said, this one is going to be my town. This is going to be it for me. And here, I'm really going to live.
Me gustó desde que yo entré, dije,
Fate brought them together in Farmingdale and made them neighbors. Many of them were attracted to the growing population of Central American immigrant day laborers who had started arriving in the area. It was a source of ongoing employment in the informal economy that depended on the men of the community for work in landscaping, construction, maintenance, and other temporary jobs. But as we'll see in this episode, the grass isn't always greener on the other side.
Apologies for that little mix-up with the stuff. I'm trying to get Maria's kids into the building. I think they're here, I'm not sure. But anyway, so that was the interruption. So we heard a few voices there. Isidoro, I want to start with you. Maybe you can talk about how it was for you when you arrived to Farmingdale. What attracted you to Farmingdale as a place to locate? Si te puedes hablar un poco sobre cómo llegaste a Farmingdale y cómo te pareció. ¿A ti te gustó? ¿Cómo llegaste aquí para crear sus hijos? Habla un poco de eso, por favor.
Antes que todo, buenas noches.
First of all, good evening to everyone.
Bueno, mi historia, desde que yo llegué a Farmingdale, yo era un teenager, un adolescente.
Well, you know, my history in Farmingdale, when I came, I was a teenager, an adolescent.
Vine de California. Cuando vine de El Salvador, pasé por California.
I came from El Salvador, passing through California before coming here.
Tengo 4 hermanos en California.
I have 4 siblings in California,
y tengo 3 hermanos acá en New York.
and I have 3 siblings here in New York.
Y cuando decidí venir a Farmingdale es porque, bueno, tenía mis 3 hermanos viviendo acá en New York y vivía en Farmingdale.
And when I decided to come here to Farmingdale, it's because I had my 3 brothers living here in Farmingdale.
Y bueno, como dije, era un adolescente y bueno, me comencé a relacionar con amigos, conociendo el town, con personas que veníamos juntos en mi viaje.
And as an adolescent, I began making friends, meeting different people that lived in the town, also people that had done the trip with me.
Pero ya cuando uno se va relacionando, pues uno quiere pues trabajar para ayudar a sus padres y bueno, sí conseguí trabajo, era lo que yo quería y por eso me vine de California para poder trabajar aquí en New York.
And as you go meeting people, you start wanting to work to be able to help support your parents. And I did find work, and that's after all why I came here from California.
Y mientras pues fui creciendo y ya de ser un adolescente ya a ser un adulto, conocí a mi esposa.
And as I was growing up, going from being an adolescent, becoming an adult, I met my wife.
Y bueno, ya después pues comenzamos y nos conocimos porque yo vivía en el 175 donde vivía mi hermano y enfrente del 150, el building 150.
And we started going out. I met her outside of the 175 where my brother was, and right in front of the 150 building.
Y bueno, la historia es de que bueno, ya cuando pues ya mi familia ya fue creciendo, conocí a mi esposa, comenzaron a pues la familia a crecer, ya mis niños iban creciendo y bueno, siempre nosotros íbamos mirando algo diferente que como que había ya un cambio en Farmingdale, estaba cambiando un poco hacia nosotros los latinos.
So, as my story was developing, I began to have a family growing up, met a wife, I had my kids, and they were growing up and started to notice something different in a change in the way that people were perceiving Latinos in Farmingdale.
Y bueno, ya mirábamos un poco como que había un poco ya de racismo porque había muchos jornaleros que ya comenzaban a buscar trabajo en las esquinas.
And it seemed like there was already some type of racism going on, and there were many day workers that were already looking for work on different corners.
Y bueno, cuando algún contratista iba a querer buscar esos jornaleros para llevarlos a trabajar, los encargados del village se encargaban de darle tickets a los que iban a levantar los jornaleros.
And when the contractor would go to pick up those day workers that wanted to get work, the authorities in the village would give out tickets to them for doing that.
Y bueno, hasta nosotros que vivíamos en el building 150 y como el parqueo de nosotros era donde pudiéramos encontrar, a veces no encontrábamos cerca del building, nos íbamos a parquear un poco retirado.
So we lived in the 150 building and there was a park we could meet at. Sometimes we'd have to park a little bit far away.
Y bueno, ellos pensaban que también nosotros éramos los que íbamos a buscar jornaleros y a veces nos daban ticket.
They would view us that we were also those day workers looking, and they would give us a ticket as well.
Entonces, vamos a seguir con eso en el siguiente clip que vamos a poner ahora. We're going to play a clip that's in a second about how the day laborers were being targeted, and by extension, the residents in the Secatogue complex were being targeted as well as a result of that. But I wanted to Ana Maria to see if you could just briefly tell us your reaction to arriving to Farmingdale. We heard your voice a little bit here, but we're so happy that you made it. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about briefly how you felt when you got to Farmingdale. Muchas gracias por menos mal que llegaste, estamos muy contentos de verte aquí con nosotros. Si puedes hablar brevemente cómo llegaste a Farmingdale y cómo te pareció cuando llegaste aquí por primera vez.
Buenas tardes a todos y a todas y sean bienvenidos a esta gran historia que fue de mucha lucha para el profesor, para mis compañeros de Builde, ¿verdad? Y hemos adquirido pues una gran experiencia de convivencia a nivel hispano. Tal vez si no hubiera pasado esto.
First of all, good evening to everyone, and thank you so much. This fight that we've had, it's been a long one, and especially thank you to the professors who have helped us, to the people I worked with, the people that I lived with, that I worked with in the building.
Y pues empezó la historia en el 2000. Yo llegaba al pueblo de Farmingdale. Cuando la persona que me llevó ahí, yo dije, en este pueblo me gusta y en este pueblo voy a vivir. Y mis padres, mis abuelos me decían que donde yo pagar renta y pagar impuestos, esa es mi tierra, que tengo que luchar por la tierra y libertad.
My story begins in 2000 when the person who brought me here. And, you know, at first I knew that I felt that I liked it here and I liked the town. My parents told me that the place where you pay rent and you pay taxes, that's your land and you need to fight for that because that belongs to you.
Y después en eso vinieron pues historias. Primero un building que estaba enfrente de Sanquilia, que también tomó fuego y murieron 2 personas, un adulto y un niño, pero ahí nadie tomó en cuenta. Después pasó a 130 y pasó lo mismo, hubo quemazón y tampoco hubieron respuestas a las autoridades sobre toda esa gente. Y luego le tocó a 150 Secatogue, pero las cosas no se hacen porque yo sea muy buena, sino porque Dios sabe lo que necesitamos cada persona. Y en ese... Sorry, lo siento.
So the stories really started to begin then with the buildings. First, there was a fire in one of the buildings where 2 people died, 1 adult and 1 child. Then there was another fire in the 130 building. Things were burned, but there was no response whatsoever from the authorities. And then something also happened in the 150. And I know that ultimately, God knows why these things happen.
Y después, pues ahí conocí a mi gran amiga y compañera Cristina y a la señora, ya se me olvidó su nombre, ellos abrieron la casa comunal, ¿verdad? Y ahí nos reuníamos a tomar cafecito para los jornaleros. Ahí se reunían los jornaleros. Y de ahí desciende mi historia, ¿verdad? Yo tenía un accidente y no podía trabajar y entonces yo asistí a esa casa comunal, según yo, para estudiar inglés, pero no, porque yo me sentía sola en la casa.
So, you know, I met my friend then at that point, Christina, and the other one who at this moment slips my mind her name. And, you know, we started to meet and have meetings for coffee at their house, which they opened up to us. And I started to tell my story. And I had an accident. You know, I wasn't able to work because of that accident.
Y ahí conocí a Cristina, a todos los jornaleros, a la compañera que está enfrente. A los demás vecinos pues ya nos conocíamos porque pues en ese entonces Ana María no era muy comunicativa, solo salía de la casa al trabajo y solo veía a los vecinos, pero no los saludaba, ¿verdad? Pero a través de este caso tuve más convivencia con las personas.
So I would meet with Christina and the other day workers, all of us would meet together and would get to know each other and really communicate more, be more open. Ana Maria was not very communicative with other people before that, but through that experience started to open up more.
So what we're just going to, for the next clip, which focuses on the day laborers, And the whole third episode is, from my standpoint, is one of the most compelling episodes because it talks about the situation on Long Island at the time in 2004, but even before that, and the levels of tension. Long Island was pretty much like the center nationally of these battles going on around immigrant rights. And it was very ugly and very hateful. And some of that was emanating into the reality of their lives in Farmingdale. And so let's play this one clip here. Again, is how the escalating tensions against the day laborers were beginning to bubble up in Farmingdale. Chris, I'm gonna ask you.
So the Secatogue 9 were suddenly experiencing a growing range of hardships in the building they called home. But it was only in hindsight that they realized those hardships were designed specifically to get them to leave.
We saw from the moment that we started with the day labor organizing, we could see that, that they were not wanted in the town.
Nadia Marin Molina is a longtime activist and civil rights attorney who has worked for years organizing immigrant day laborers on Long Island. At the time of the crisis at Secatogue, she was the head of the workplace project, or Centro de Trabajadores, based in Hempstead.
It was clear that the workers were seen by some section of the community, right, as, I think, they would use the word like blight, right? And it's like, oh, we have these guys like right in the middle of our downtown. This is not how we want our downtown to look. So you could see that they had the intention of getting the workers first away, right? And that was part of the reason why not to have them on Main Street, right? Is to have them away somewhere else.
So while only a few of the Secatogue 9 were day laborers, many of their neighbors were. And as they waited for work, they were systematically discriminated against by the village and other members of the Farmingdale community.
Y eso prácticamente pues a nosotros nos incomodaba porque nosotros a veces no.
That was uncomfortable for us because we lived close by where all of that was happening. We happened to go by and park there for a moment. The police would give us tickets and accuse us of picking up workers. So for those of us living in 150 Secatogue, we not only had problems with the village, but with the owner of the building too. And on top of that, she was trying to sell the building without even telling us.
Y tampoco nos informábamos nosotros que el building se iba a vender.
Exacto, sí, pero ya después, posteriormente, sí, se iba poniendo la cosa más difícil porque...
Then things began getting harder because on the corner where some of us were looking for work, the mayor started cracking down and prohibiting people stopping there. Any person who stopped there to look to hire workers for the day got a ticket of $150. That was horrible because people didn't even stop there anymore. So then, even if you're standing there on the corner, you can't even get a day's work now.
Porque uno ya ahí parado no conseguía ni un día de trabajo.
So I want to see, Chris, I know you've been looking at these issues for a long time in Long Island and elsewhere. If you could just talk a little bit about that dynamic that was happening, and then Steph, if you can get into how that struggle around day laborers joined the struggle around the housing discrimination case that was unfolding. So if you could just kind of outline briefly what was going on in Long Island, not only in Farmingdale, but in Long Island at the time.
Sure. So I mean, when we look at the Farmingdale case, in some ways we're looking at the intersection of a couple of different processes taking place at different scales, right? On the one hand, as we've already heard, there was, on Long Island at the time, kind of a growing service sector, a growing demand for labor that was partly kind of pulling people towards, sometimes very actively pulling people towards the region. That was not, and in not just in the landscaping sector, which got a lot of attention, but also in sectors like manufacturing and domestic service. At the same time, we've had many suburbs in places like Long Island that were reckoning with the after effects of their patterns of original development, right? That they had been places that had been built out for cars, for car transportation, downtowns that had been that were aging, infrastructure that was aging. And both residents and businesses were being pulled away by new residential development, new commercial development, even farther out. So what you see at the same time is you see both kind of a push to revitalize some of these areas among long-term residents, and planners, policymakers, elected officials, and so on, at the same time as you see new populations that are entering both the region as a whole and particularly places like Farmingdale that have at least comparably cheaper housing.
Steph, do you want to touch quickly on the issue of how those two struggle or join?
Many of the established members of the community were concerned about the day laborers congregating on the street. And in some ways that became the focal point for the blog posting, for the vituperative type of speeches that were made at the Board of Trustees meeting. As Christina, one of the activists in support of the Secatogue 9, tells the story on the podcast that she's sitting at a Board of Trustees meeting where they're talking about the day laborer problem, and a white woman in front of her, who she has never seen before, turns around, looks at her, and says, "You people have to have your tubes pumped." This is the kind of sentiment that began to brew in the town, and as a result, in the 2003 mayoral campaign, the mayor of the eventual mayor, George Graff, ran on a platform that I'm going to get rid of the day laborers, but also I am going to replace the housing where they live, what was called Little Latin America, with luxury housing, so that we no longer have to experience having these kinds of folks in the community.
Isidoro, how did that make you feel? How did that hate that you were seeing in meetings, et cetera, how did that make you feel? ¿Cómo te hacía sentir eso? Ese odio que ya se estaba como ampliando dentro de la comunidad de Farmingdale en contra de los jornaleros, pero también en contra de la comunidad en general.
Bueno, claro que me sentía mal porque tenía niños que estaban creciendo y que también pues no quería que crecieran en un ambiente donde había mucho racismo.
Of course, I felt very bad. I had my own kids who were growing up, and I didn't want them to grow up in an environment around racism.
Como bueno, ahora se puede decir que todo pues ha cambiado muy diferente, pero en aquel tiempo, volviendo el tiempo atrás, pues pasamos por muchas dificultades. Es bien difícil cuando pues uno tiene niños. Yo tengo pues 3, en aquel entonces eran unos babies, eran 3 niños y se me hacía difícil a mí, pues ya con los problemas que venían en el building, teníamos muchos problemas en el building, pero
now it has changed and things are different, but thinking back, it was different. And it was very difficult having kids with 3 kids and the difficulties, especially with the problems we were having in the building at the time.
La historia es bien larga, es demasiado larga y nunca la contaríamos, no la terminamos. Lo único que yo sé es que esta batalla que nosotros tuvimos contra el Village, no la hubiéramos ganado solo nosotros, si no hubiéramos tenido al profesor Krieger.
It's a long story. We would never finish if we told the whole thing, but I just know that this battle that we fought against the Village, we would have not won if it was just us on our own. We would have not done it without Professor Krieger.
Porque con tantos problemas que teníamos, pues nosotros no teníamos voz ni voto para nada porque no sabíamos qué hacer.
And with these problems that we had, we didn't have a voice or a vote. We didn't know what to do about it.
Pues él se puede decir que cayó como un ángel del cielo para nosotros, él y sus alumnos.
You could say that he was like an angel that fell from the sky for us, him and his students.
Eso es un buen punto. That's a good place to get into the next episode, which quite frankly was the most wonkish, policy-driven, and most challenging one to write. I think Chris had his hand on it. I had my hand on it a million times. We had some students with their hand on it. Wasn't easy because it's really trying to explain the issues of development on Long Island, in the suburbs in general, and in particular this idea of smart growth, which was in many ways a good thing, right? The idea of moving away from the car-driven development that was the foundation of Long Island suburbs on Long Island. And so this episode, in this section, we hear more or less what smart growth is, which again, on the surface sounds really good. And then so what we'll do is ask what went wrong, why did it not work in Farmingdale? So we can play this segment here briefly as we move forward.
Would it provide opportunities for higher quality affordable housing? Or would it force poorer residents out in a process that echoed the gentrification of many New York City neighborhoods? Would it lead to integration among all sectors? Or would it lead to the expulsion of immigrant families who had thought of Farmingdale as their own home? Answers to these questions depended on the extent to which the immigrant residents living at 150 Secatogue would be considered, much less invited, to participate in the planning process.
So the roots of smart growth really date back to World War II.
Dr. Christopher Neat is an associate professor of sociology at Hofstra University. He's the academic director of the National Center for Suburban Studies, one of the co-producers of this audio series.
It was a time when many GIs, they were returning home. It was after the Great Depression, it was after the war, many people were starting families.
When a man gets out of the Army or Navy or Marine, he's worried most about a job, an education, and a home.
And new communities were built, many of them exclusively for middle-class white people in the suburbs across the country.
The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill of Rights.
This housing was often built very quickly and was very oriented towards car usage, right? People drove, they wanted their house, they wanted their lawn, and they wanted to own a car and use a car, which was kind of a symbol of the modern post-war world.
They wanted something better.
So you had these suburban landscapes that were very car dependent, and many of them, places like Long Island, had really not been well planned at the regional level.
Smart growth was seen as a path to correct this poor planning, as a way to improve infrastructure. It was seen as a way to attract new investment and create opportunities for small business and families. Regional and national policymakers and planners have been working to make suburban living more sustainable, to move away from the car-centric vision of the 1950s and 60s. By the 1990s, the old-school car-centric approach was no longer seen as environmentally or economically sustainable. Smart growth caught on all over the country.
That's done. So what went wrong in Farmingdale? Chris, maybe if you could just get into that a little bit.
Sure. So as you said, smart growth does have there are positive things about this movement of primarily planners, but also some policymakers, some grassroots groups, to rethink the way that we do suburban development, right? So smart growth had a number of goals, as Mario mentioned, reducing car dependency, producing more compact, multi-use development, reducing suburban sprawl, instead of redeveloping places like Farmingdale, rather than moving ever outward, right, into what could otherwise be open space, et cetera. And so there are advantages to it. Even very early in the smart growth movement, though, some of its critics pointed out that by kind of limiting development, you were potentially also limiting the amount of affordable housing that would be built. And so there were concerns raised as early as the 1980s that smart growth might produce higher housing prices, for example. There are also some concerns, so that was the first concern. And the movement as a whole, many of the groups that represented it, did start including some of them, not all of them, but some of them started to include greater concerns for affordability in their work. But at the same time that was happening, you also have the politics of these aging suburbs, which, as we were just discussing, are shifting as their demographics change, right? So many of these places that used to be almost entirely white, working in middle-class suburbs are now becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. And that's kind of good, sometimes creating inter-community conflict. And it's also important to kind of keep in mind that after the 60s and 70s, it became, despite the blog postings that we saw in Farmingdale, it became, at least among many elected officials, many planners and so on, it was no longer as socially acceptable to express racial animus. I'm not saying that people didn't, but it was less socially acceptable. And so what we started to see in many, in at least some of the places that were trying to redevelop themselves as suburbs, was that people would use this kind of the positive image of smart growth, the positive image of redevelopment and its potential, as in some ways a cover for trying to expel groups of people that were considered, at least by the white longtime residents, undesirable.
And in this case, in Farmingdale, they were not consulted. The communities
That's
were not
right,
involved.
and that was kind of the key element of smart growth. In theory, many of these groups said that we're going to try to consult the community and engage folks, and the devil was often in the details. Exactly who was reached out to, who was consulted, and who wasn't, and also whose ideas, once presented, actually made their way to the final plans. And that was one of the ways that the planning in Farmingdale, as we see in the episode, really ultimately fell short.
I know we're under the tyranny of the clock, so I want to just go quickly to the last part and then maybe get everybody to comment on the way this case was litigated, the strategy that was used by the law students, Steph Krieger and his team, but also with the local activists, with the organizers, and obviously the folks themselves, the plaintiffs themselves. So and there was so many elements to it, and it wasn't easy. But in this segment, you'll just hear a little clip about a very unique approach that Professor Krieger, Attorney Krieger, applied in this case and in many other cases.
To meet these challenges, Krieger, as he had done throughout the case, thought outside the box. This time, his thoughts brought him to Hollywood.
I was watching Moss at the time.
See with the tail end? Yeah, probably in the water. You can make that show in an hour. Ethan, get up there to that fuselage. There may actually be survivors.
And what hit me was that each episode of Moss was like a character study of the backstory of one of the passengers who was on this island, and then they build on that story. And that how a trial in some ways is the same thing, that each of our clients had this backstory that needed to be told, and that would be the context for showing the damages.
Inspired by the TV series Lost, Krieger teamed up with his former student, Reza Rezvani, and came up with a novel idea. They decided to organize the evidence using something uncommon for trial attorneys, but very useful for filmmakers. They used storyboarding.
Steph and I are big film people and to convey stuff visually, so we immediately went towards, how would we do this if this is a movie? How would we, what scenes would there be? What would we show?
You can just imagine how the ideas started flowing.
And then, one thing led to another, and then we started wondering how filmmakers come up with the ultimate version that you see on the screen, which got us into storyboarding, and then we got into that process, and then we realized, holy shit, we can take this process and actually convey it to actual real tangible lessons and trial prep. It was pretty cool.
Okay, so maybe I'll ask you, Meredith, you've been here with us all this time. How did that unfold?
Oh, sorry, I don't know these microphones right now. How did this unfold, the whole process of storyboarding, and obviously litigating this complex case?
Sure. So as you can see, there's a storyboard up on the screen, so I can navigate you through that. So the idea of a storyboard is really about organization. It is to take every single little bit of evidence you have, organize it either by witness, and then to think, and I think this is Mitch who was in clinic with me looking at his, Not only to organize what order you want to call witnesses in, but to organize what order you want the story to play out in that witness, or do you want a story to play out over several witnesses? So it's an incredibly effective way to organize. What we had to do is we had to create every single moment or beat that we wanted to. So if you're into creative writing or screenwriting, you know that a beat is like a sub-moment in a scene. Those get put into scenes, those get put into acts, and then you're basically creating a movie either through a direct or a cross-examination so that the jury or the judge can understand, because you put it in a form of communication that everyone can understand, which is a story. So we would actually take and we had to make note cards or cut pieces of paper out, put them up on a board, and we would debate which order they would go in, what witnesses had to go in what order, what kind of characters each witnesses were. So it was fascinating, it was effective, it was something that I still use today.
Steph, do you want to add something quickly to that? I want to ask Ana Maria and Isidoro if they trusted you guys. Okay, esto fue un proceso de muchos años. This was a long process, the case. It lasted 8 years, at least 8 years, right? And lots of ups and downs during the process of the case, which you can hear in the series. So my question to both Isidoro and Ana Maria is, describe points where you had lost faith, where you were ready to give up, where you started to wonder about steps and the students' strategies. Talk a little bit about those doubts you had. Si puedes hablar un poco sobre, porque el proceso fue muy largo, duró 8 años, muchas subidas y bajadas durante el proceso, pero también, bueno, el caso fue complicado. Entonces, hubo momentos para ustedes dos cuando ya tenían ganas de ya dejarlo ir y resignarse y retirarse del caso y que todavía tenían confianza todavía con Steph y el equipo de Steph.
Bueno, sí, había momentos que nosotros, no solo yo, todos mis compañeros, cuando íbamos hasta las reuniones, nosotros mirábamos que el caso se iba alargando y siempre había como un tropiezo ahí y bueno, decíamos nosotros, pero nosotros hablábamos todos mis compañeros.
Yes, there were definitely moments, and not just me, but also with my other peers in the meetings. The case kept seeming like it was getting longer, and we would run into another obstacle, but all of us would talk amongst each other.
Y nosotros, pues, cuando hablábamos, nos poníamos y decíamos, pero si él no se rinde, ¿por qué nosotros nos vamos a rendir? Y decíamos, pues, vamos a seguir.
We would talk and, we would think, well, if he's not giving up, then why should we give up? And so then we decided we would keep going.
Y bueno, como yo sé que este proceso fue muy largo, hubieron muchos estudiantes que se involucraron en este caso. Cuando nosotros mirábamos nuevos estudiantes, nosotros decíamos, otra vez vamos a comenzar de nuevo porque hay que otra vez darles nueva información a los estudiantes.
And I know, it was a long process and new students would get involved and we would think sometimes a new student means we have to start again because we're going to have to tell them, the new students, everything from the beginning.
Pero no, nosotros llegamos a la conclusión de que no íbamos a perder ese caso porque teníamos una persona que siempre estuvo al lado de nosotros y siempre tuvimos fe de que íbamos a llegar hasta el final, no importa cómo, pero vamos a llegar.
But no, in conclusion, we decided that we realized we weren't going to lose the case because we had one person on our side that was always on our side, and we had the faith that we will get to the end of this no matter what.
María, ¿quieres comentar un poco? Do you want to make a comment on that?
Yo sí llegó un momento en que le dije a todos, ya no quiero seguir, termino, no quiero saber más de este caso. Pero cuando mi compañera Cristina, ¿verdad? La mujer que impulsó esto y sus lágrimas que le rodaron, ¿verdad? Porque ella ha hecho un trabajo arduo, un sacrificio desde aquella vez que le habían balaceado su escuelita, ¿verdad? Y ella tenía...
So, yes, there were definitely moments. You know, I said to myself that I was done. That was it. I'm not going to go on, no more. But thankfully, there was Christina, the woman who had initiated this whole thing. I saw her and the tears that she had in her eyes, the work she had done, the sacrifice that she had made since the very beginning.
Y me movió mi corazón y dije, bueno, volvamos otra vez, ¿verdad? Y volví a comenzar, pero con un impulso grande, que tenía que ser por principios y por ideales, no por dinero. Y mis ideales eran llegar hasta lo último, hasta la Corte Federal. Pero como había una conciencia, yo me debía a todos mis compañeros y la mayoría ya estaba cansada, ¿no? Pero yo estaba dispuesta a todo, ¿verdad? Y como decía el compañero...
Un momento. Voy a traducir.
Sorry.
So seeing that, I was moved in my heart, and I said, let's try this again. So we started again, but I had a different way of looking at it. We started again, and I knew that I had to be doing this for the principles and the ideals, and not for the money. And my goal, my ideal, was to make it all the way to federal court, to get it approved from there.
Y quería recalcar lo que decía el compañero, ¿verdad? Yo decía, pues si Dios nos mandó un bufete de abogados, una casa comunal, ¿qué más puedo? Tengo todas las herramientas para llegar a lo último, ¿verdad? Y gracias a ellos, como decía el compañero, un montón de ángeles, y yo me sentí orgullosa de ver que cada nuevo que llegaban y se graduaban, yo sentía ver a cada uno como si fueran mis hijos, graduarse. Felicidades a todos ellos. Ojalá que hayan logrado sus sueños de graduarse y servirle al pueblo.
So, and I said to myself that if this life has given me a law firm for this, a house, what else do I need? I have all the tools that I need. And so thank you to them and the angels that they have been. I'm so proud of them. Whenever they graduated, I would see them come in and graduate, and they'd be like my own kids. And thank you for everything that they've done.
Solo les quiero decir gracias a todos ellos y a ellas, ¿verdad? Que se tomaron el tiempo para llegar día a día a las conferencias que se hacían en la escuelita. Gracias a todos ellos y al profesor que los llama, ¿verdad? Ojalá y hagan cosas buenas como este señor. Gracias.
So I want to just really thank all of them, the men and women, everything they did day after day, coming to their conferences and their classes in school, working with their professor, and I hope that they all also do good things like this man here has done.
So I think
we've extended the time, it's 7:30, so I think we should, that's, I think, a good way to complete and finish. We have some refreshments for, a little reception as we finish. So I want to thank all of you for joining us and hearing us out. We're gonna open up the conversation in the reception, so we'll leave it at that. Yes, Steph, you want to say? Please.
Yeah, I think that it might be good if Mr. Rivera and Ms. Gomez said where they are now. And just for everyone who hasn't read the Newsday article by that wonderful journalist, Mark Jones, that because of the change in administration, the change of attitude of the village administrators, because of the wonderful work that Sharon Mullen and the Long Island Housing Partnership, there is a $35 million affordable housing project, 70 apartments that will be opening in June. So just in terms of what's on the ground in Farmingdale, that's what's on the ground. I think it'd be
¿Cómo te ha ido? Where are you living now? How are things now? ¿Cómo van las cosas ahora donde vives? Ahora?
Bueno, sí, yo no estoy viviendo en Florida, ahorita yo me mudé para Amityville, pero no, sí, la vida, pues, me ha sonreído, se puede decir, me ha ido bien. Y no es que no vivo en Florida porque hay racismo, no, Florida es lindo, está diferente, la comunidad ahora es muy diferente, pero en el futuro siempre he pensado regresar ahí.
So I'm not in Farmingdale anymore. I'm actually in Annandale and Amityville. And but you know, life has been good to me. Things have gone well for me. It's not because of racism that I'm not here. Farmingdale has changed a lot. It's a different place now, and I know that in the future, potentially I could.
Ana María, ¿cómo van las cosas?
Bueno, pues yo sí sigo siguiendo en Farmingdale. Siempre digo que a mí nadie me mueve de donde yo vivo. Así tenga que dar vuelta en el pueblo, pero yo voy a estar ahí. Vivo ahí en la 40 Elizabeth, de los apartamentos que son de Cornerstone y ahora Fairfield. Ahí vive mi hija con mi nieta y a veces yo, porque después Dios me dio una casa que rentamos, ¿verdad? Y ahí viven mis hijos. Y estoy en las dos casas, ¿verdad? Nomás en la misma calle, un bloque nada más, y entonces soy muy feliz. Ya soy una abuela con 12 nietos, ¿verdad? 3 nietos que tengo aquí, nacidos aquí.
So I am still here in Farmingdale. I say no one's gonna move me from where I live, and so I still am here on 540 in Elizabeth, by the Cornerstone in Fairfield, and you know my daughter is here. My granddaughter is we're 2 houses just 1 block away. I'm very happy with that. I have 12 grandkids.
Y me están acompañando esta tarde, no todos, ¿verdad? Pero mi otra familia está en México.
They're here tonight, not all of them. Some are also in Mexico.
So that is a good subject. Larry, we have to raise some funds for ¿Qué pasa Long Island season 2? That coming.
The Asian phase.
No, anyway, muchas gracias Ana María, Isidoro, toda la familia que vinieron. Thank you everybody for joining us again. Justin's right out the door, and Steph, you did it. You did it. You made it.